So JD, my co-writer, and I, from the very beginning of this process, the rule was go back to the books, go back to the books, go back to the books. And sometimes that's going for specific information.
So at the end, it's all about going to the source material and go to the books, this is what I did. I went back to the books, I read them again, and everything is in there.
Because no one puts any more pressure on us than we put on ourselves.
Of course.
Because we love this material so much.
Yeah.
This is the language of our soul.
Yeah.
And it means so much to us to get it right.
You have fought long enough, Galadriel. Put up your sword.
Without it, what am I to be?
Not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn! Treacherous as the sea!
What made you mad enough to want to...
Pure ignorance, sheer stupidity, and wild recklessness.
With Tolkien's life work and legacy getting devoured by the infinite black void of streaming services, there is no intellectual property safe from the looming threat of multi-billion-dollar machines setting them ablaze right before fan bases' eyes. It's an outright inevitability. We're in an ever-prominent age of streamlined cultural degradation. Shows and films are becoming astronomically more expensive to produce, while the quality of characters, world building, and overall plot structure is sacrificed for the sake of quantity. As long as there's some hint of the next shiny thing, or an upcoming cameo appearance, the current product can be as shallow and vapid as it needs to be. People will even applaud and demand for more.
It's just so fun coming up with different lawsuits and court cases for her to be embroiled in, because it is such a built-in engine for bringing in guest stars and cameos and also new characters that we get to create and invent.
It's clear that Amazon believed that they didn't need the likes of Tom Shippey or Peter Jackson to help produce the show. That Lord of the Rings as a franchise was simply too big to fail, and that despite the hundreds of millions of dollars already poured into the first season, they could still safely contract out multiple seasons well in advance. And while that sentiment might ring true under certain metrics, Tolkien's life work has essentially been a cornerstone of fantasy fiction, revered still by many to this day. And to see it so blatantly defiled by gross incompetence is a complete slap in the face to the community that has elevated the Lord of the Rings universe to its stature, and surely has the man himself doing barrel rolls in his grave.
Do a barrel roll!
It's questionable whether The Rings of Power as an adaptation was doomed from the very start. After all, Amazon only had the rights to the Second Age and couldn't drift too far in either direction of the timeline. But frankly, I'm relieved that these mouth-breathing monks weren't able to get their grubby paws on anything from the First or Third Age. It doesn't necessarily stop them from completely botching established characters, true, but it does establish a threshold of just how far they can carry out their depraved fetish for altering the DNA of Middle-earth. However, one could argue that straying away from the source material is inherently a good thing, because it allows the show to appeal to a wider demographic of people. Which I would certainly be willing to entertain that sentiment if the story itself was actually well written. But in embarrassing fashion, The Rings of Power frequently fails to manage to stand on its own 2 feet. The script is completely riddled with incoherent dialogue, flimsy and inconsistent world building, nonsensical character motivations, and horrendous action sequences. Nor is any of this supported by the creative leads constantly trying to cram their pseudo-intellectualism down viewers' throats.
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot?
Buoyancy.
Because the stone sees only downward.
Not exactly where I thought this was headed, but maybe he'll tie it all back together.
The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under. But the ship has a secret. For unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up, fixed upon the light that guides her.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Are you seriously trying to convince me that Galadriel's supposedly wise older brother doesn't understand the most basic bitch of concepts that is buoyancy? If your ship displaces an equal amount of water to its weight, then your ship will float. It's really not that complicated. I realize there's supposed to be some deeper philosophical message here, but you can't claim you genuinely care about the source material while simultaneously relegating an extremely significant character like Finrod to a clumsy metaphor which accomplishes nothing except to paint him as an insufferable moron. A metaphor that Tolkien himself would never dare put to paper, might I add. And to make matters worse, you're also having him pass down his brainrot level logic onto another extremely crucial character.
Good job.
Still, even at an early age, we can always count on Galadriel to weigh in with some truly life-altering wisdom of her own.
But sometimes, the lights shine just as brightly reflected in the water as they do in the sky. How am I to know which lights to follow?
If you are unable to determine the difference between the sky and the ocean, then I'm afraid you simply aren't long for this world. And to add insult to injury, we're not even given the answer to her stupid-ass question. He just randomly whispers into her ear because the writers at the time couldn't think of anything clever, forcing them to bullshit up an actual answer later on during production. I'm aware that last bit is rather speculative, but I'm firmly convinced of it. Though something I'm not so convinced of is this piss-poor bit of narration from Galadriel.
For his orcs had spread to every corner of Middle-earth, multiplying ever greater under the command of his most devoted servant, Sauron. More and more of our kind began to believe that Sauron was but a memory.
There are moments in the show where the writing is so completely void of any logic, where it forces you to hit pause and question whether humans truly do deserve to procreate. Still, just to clarify, the elves knew that Sauron was gathering an army of orcs, but chose to do nothing about it, and then over the course of time just forgot he existed.
While Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
I know the Dark Lord Bezos himself wanted this to be a Game of Thrones clone, but fucking hell. However, there's one person who didn't forget about Sauron, and her name is Brick. Because naturally, this discounted version of Galadriel possesses the emotional and acting range of a lobotomy.
But you have always been my friend.
You see, she's deeply traumatized by the death of her brother, whose body was marked by Sauron, and nobody aside from Brick finds that incredibly strange. But in a fit of rage, she pillages Finrod's tomb so that she can take up his task of hunting down the Dark Lord.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
Now, I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to Tolkien lore, but I know enough to spot when the show drastically deviates from it. And there are some pretty notable problems with this entire string of events. Mainly being that Finrod wasn't directly killed by Sauron. Finrod eventually died from his wounds after brutally slaughtering one of Sauron's werewolves like an absolute Chad. And Sauron never marked Finrod's body with a symbol because why would he? Especially considering what that mark is revealed to represent later on in the show, but we'll definitely cross that bridge whenever we get to it. Also, at no point during the first or even a good chunk of the Second Age did Galadriel ever set out to get revenge against Sauron for killing her brother. Nor is she or anyone else at this point in the Second Age aware that Sauron is actually amassing an army. That isn't revealed until after he disguises himself as a Maya named Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and forges the Rings of Power. You know, the entire premise for the War of the Ring. But barring all of that, I wouldn't inherently be against the idea of Brick taking up a quest to avenge her brother's death, if it wasn't actually a thinly veiled attempt to attach an archetype that doesn't even remotely fall in line with her character. The writers had a clear desire to mold her into Galadriel Skywalker by having her perform these death-defying leaps and actively putting her men in harm's way just to highlight how much of a badass she is, all while completely removing the mysticism that's been longly associated with her character. In contrast with Jackson's depiction of Galadriel, the films never had to explain through exposition why she's so crucial to the world of Middle-earth, or rely on shallow acts of physical strength. It was conveyed through her mannerisms, her wisdom, how highly others regarded her, and her sheer resolve. Galadriel is first and foremost a protector, willing to provide sagely advice and aid to those in her company.
Do not be afraid, Mithrandir. A boy Ili Aliathon.
These are the qualities that have made her an endearing and respected character. Now, some of you might be forgiving towards Brick for being the total antithesis of all that because you want to see her develop into the Galadriel we see in Fellowship. Which, fair enough, but the problem is at this point in the timeline, Galadriel would already be around 5,000 years old. Quite frankly, the writers need to do a lot to convince me that an immortal being who's dwelled in Middle-earth for centuries is prone to impulsivity and recklessness. let alone portray her to be so self-absorbed with her lust for revenge that she has zero consideration for the well-being of her subjects and is needlessly abrasive to everyone she comes across.
They paid for this isle with the blood of their kin.
What the elf means.
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it.
After the group miraculously manages to climb this death trap of Nice Shelf, the show wastes very little time contradicting itself.
It's been years since the last orc was sighted.
I thought the orcs spread all across Middle-earth after Morgoth's defeat. Surely during the centuries Galadriel's company has spent hunting down Sauron, they would have encountered at least one. In your half-assed attempt at a Peter Jackson-style prologue, you couldn't even manage to adhere to your bullshit revised history you invented for Tolkien's universe. How utterly pathetic. Unfortunately, all of this is then followed up by the writers admitting they know absolutely nothing about orcs.
How long can living flesh endure where even sunlight fears to tread?
Well, you see, a place where the sun hardly ever shines would be the perfect place for them to establish some type of base at, because orcs are heavily affected by sunlight. In fact, I'm kind of left wondering how an elf wouldn't know this, considering the Noldor went to war against their kind, which lasted over the course of centuries. For the Rings of Power supposedly being the novel that Tolkien never wrote, we're already off to an extremely rocky start. Following that painful bit of dialogue, though, Brick and the gang stumble upon Sauron's fortress, and after searching around a bit, Brick makes a stunning observation.
This place is so evil, our torches give off no warmth.
Jesus, that is some clunky bit of exposition. I'm not exactly sure how their torches would continue to burn if it's truly so cold to the point where they no longer give off any heat. Having them get extinguished upon entry seems way more logical of an explanation and doesn't require this stinker of a line to exist in the script.
This place is so evil, our torches give off no warmth.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
The only thing I could imagine the scene might be referring to is whenever Gandalf throws the ring into the fire and hands it to Frodo, revealing that it's actually cool to the touch. But that had nothing to do with the ring being so evil that it makes fire cold. It's because, as Elrond explains to the rest of the Fellowship,
the ring was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade.
The ring ultimately can't be affected by conventional fire, which is why Frodo is able to hold it. However, the stupid doesn't just end there. Brick and Soldier Guy make their way to a secret part of the fortress. At least that's what I'm calling him anyways, because I'm 99% certain he doesn't have an actual name in this show. But as Soldier Guy continues to press Brick to have everyone return home, she makes another discovery.
This mark was left as a trail for orcs to follow. The last time I saw it was on my brother.
See, now that's some bullshit.
Not entirely sure how in the absolute hell you came to that conclusion. Unless you're seriously meaning to tell me that Sauron meant for the orcs to find Finrod's body, and interpret that mark as an order for them to raid settlements in Mordor, I mean the Southlands, 3,500 years after Finrod's death. A bit of a ballsy move if you ask me, leaving visual evidence of where you plan on amassing your secret army. Definitely worked out in Sauron's favor that apparently not even the wisest of all the Noldor aside from Galadriel knew how to use a fucking map. In fact, it would seem incompetency is a recurring theme amongst the elves. During the Peter Jackson ripoff troll fight scene, half of Brick's troops are completely getting their asses handed to them, while the other half are just standing around in confusion watching Brick single-handedly take down this troll. Nothing about this fight makes Brick look like a badass in comparison to the rest of her troops if they all have the combined intelligence of a wooden plank. But setting aside how clunky the editing and fight choreography is, I think the thing I'm taken aback by the most is how insistent this show is to retcon Galadriel into a Joan of Arc style character. I've seen many people attempt to justify this by claiming Galadriel was immensely powerful even before possessing Nenya. But a knowledge of magic wouldn't just inherently translate over to swordsmanship. I mean, aside from her very limited involvement during the kinslaying, Galadriel has never been depicted as a warrior type. She never took part in any of the battles during the First Age, or really even a good majority of them during the Second and the Third. which is why it's so strange to see her not only crudely wielding a sword, but taking down entire snow trolls single-handedly. It diminishes the sheer majesty of Galadriel's character and her influence on the world she currently exists in. The writers arbitrarily nerfed one of the more powerful figures throughout all of Middle-earth in their desire to depict a strong female protagonist.
Ironic.
But that's not the only thing to get diminished from a world-building standpoint. That's right, it's trolls. During the fight in Fellowship, the trolls' presence sets the overall stakes for the rest of the Moria sequence. That all of their lives are at serious risk, requiring the members of the Fellowship to competently work off each other's skill sets in order to survive the attack, all while highlighting another prominent tool in Sauron's Legion and providing deeper characterization to the viewer. Though in contrast, the Rings of Power Snow Troll scene is injected into the script to serve as shiny nostalgia bait, while it distracts you from how shallow and poorly executed the fight actually is. But regardless, after having just found direct evidence of Sauron's existence, Brick insists to the rest of the company that they need to push further north, only for all of them to overrule her authority and have the group return back to Lindon. Which seems like a reasonable decision. After all, if Sauron has amassed a huge army, then a small detachment of elves isn't necessarily going to cut it. But you're all still definitely going to need those weapons, though. You're standing in Sauron's former fortress and just fought a snow troll 30 seconds ago. However, instead of actually committing to any plot development for longer than 5 minutes, we then cut away to our introductory scene of the Harfoots. Now you're probably wondering what the huge difference is between a Harfoot and a typical hobbit from the Shire, and that's because there is none. Well, other than the fact that they refuse to bathe and are nomads only through sheer technicality. On rare occasions do they ever actually migrate, and the Harfoots settle down for such long periods of time that they have a general idea of what time of the year hunters pass through their area. But despite all of that, the writers desperately want you to know that the Harfoots are in fact nomads, which introduces us to our main character, Nori Baggins. She has a curious nature and a burning desire for adventure, which tends to have her antics come to the dismay of the clan elders. The reason I know all of that is because the show never shuts the hell up about it.
You are far too curious and meddlesome to have been born a Harfoot.
You know the rules. We're not supposed to be out this far. If we didn't do everything we weren't supposed to do, we'd hardly do anything at all. We can't leave him like this or the wolves will get him. So that's not who we are. That's not who you are. I can't help but feel there's wonders in this world beyond our wandering.
Attaching Bilbo's archetype onto Nori doesn't really work because you're dealing with a character who realistically should travel across Middle-earth quite frequently. If anything, Nori's motivation should be the inverse. She's constantly having to uproot her life, traveling from place to place, all while having nowhere steady to call home. Nor is she afforded the opportunity to form long-lasting relationships with others outside of her immediate circle. Nori is, by all means, a nomad by design, and her actions and motivations should be reflective of that. The writers wanted to mold her as a character that breaks norms and tradition, while force-hammering a theme into the dialogue that actually conforms to the nomadic lifestyle of the Harfoots.
Ironic.
They desperately wanted to toss hobbits into the script despite having zero clue what they wanted to do with any of these characters, or how to properly world build on any level. Speaking of which, you've probably noticed by now that there's also been very little in the way of actual plot progression. If one were being generous, they'd consider this series to have a wandering storyline.
That not all who wander or wander are lost.
You need to shut the fuck up!
But if we're being realistic, it's more along the lines of meandering. Unlike most horribly written shows where they try to cram in as much content as possible, The Rings of Power is completely lost in the dark with where it wants to take the narrative. And the intro scene to the Southlander characters is another prime example of it. All it really serves to establish is that men and elves are rather racist towards one another.
On what day was he here?
Oh, let it go, tfiends. When are you people gonna let the past go?
Past is with us all, whether we like it or not.
That's racist!
And that these two really wanna... So to spare us both of any unnecessary amount of torture, we can just skip this scene entirely. We then unfortunately cut back to Brick. She's arrived in London to inform Elrond of what she's uncovered and to demand an audience with Gil-galad. Now, it's already weird enough that Elrond is just casually dismissing potential evidence of Sauron amassing some kind of army, especially since this information is coming directly from Galadriel, one of the wisest among the Eldar. But it gets even weirder when you factor in that the
Commander of the Northern Armies, warrior of the Wastelands,
has to demand an audience with Gil-galad in the first place. Though shortly after their interaction, Gil-galad has a big reveal for Galadriel and her troops during the ceremony.
The undying lands of Valinor. At last, they are going home!
Yeah, pretty sure he wouldn't have really had a say in that at all, actually. In fact, the Noldor were sort of banned from ever sailing back to Valinor by the Valar. Eventually, they'd be granted general amnesty after the War of Wrath, but many of the Noldor still chose to remain in Middle-earth well after the fact. Chief among them being Galadriel because she wanted to preside over her realms. It's almost like if the creative leads had actually read any of the source material, they'd have known this.
So at the end, it's all about going to the source material and go to the books, you know, so this is what I did.
Liar!
Again, assuming that the show wasn't made out of pure malice, which at this rate I'm not entirely sure we can rule out of the realm of possibility. Still, this entire scene is contingent on the viewer having read, or at least possess a considerable understanding of the lore, while simultaneously breaking it. The show doesn't properly lay out why only Galadriel and her troops are allowed passage back to Valinor, and why Gil-galad of all people is the one solely making this decision, which is just outright terrible writing. But you see, continuity is a pesky thing, and we have to get rid of it in order to cram in the next smoldering pile of garbage into the dialogue.
We foresaw that if it had, she might have inadvertently kept alive the very evil she sought to defeat.
Then the shadow she sought. You believe it does exist?
That's right. Elrond and Gil-galad conspired to get rid of the most powerful elf in all of Middle-earth, because if she continued to hunt down Sauron, then she might actually find Sauron.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Also, I'm a little confused why Bitchron here is all that concerned that Galadriel was right, considering he dropped this gem of the line just a few moments ago.
If but a whisper of a rumor of the threat you perceive proves true, I will not rest until it is put right.
You more or less got what you wanted for some incredibly bizarre, stupid fucking reason. And while we're still relatively on the subject of Brick, she reluctantly decides to board a ship and head for Valinor. Without Celeborn, her husband. You know, it's pretty strange actually that there's been zero mention of him at this point in the show. I really hope they don't retcon him out of existence in an effort to ship an erotic fanfic romance between Galadriel and Sauron. More on that later. But through the power of flashbacks, the writers have finally managed to come up with an answer to Brick's infuriatingly brain-dead question from the beginning of the episode.
Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness.
I suppose you think that was terribly clever.
The only way to determine what's morally right or wrong is to touch the darkness. Are you actually fucking me? Do elves get all of their valuable life lessons and wisdom from back-alley schizophrenic tweakers? And as if that wasn't catastrophic enough already, you're actively contradicting the theme of your whole allegory. Galadriel remaining in Middle-earth to defeat Sauron has inadvertently devolved into an immoral choice to stray away from the light. It seems like Tolkien's distaste for allegory was pretty well founded, because you have blockhead writers like this who dramatically bungle them repeatedly. Though there's also the glaring issue of Brick deciding to ditch her men to go for an evening dip. I could have understood her having cold feet about returning to Valinor shortly after having just left the harbor, but they've been on this voyage for what? Days? Weeks? Possibly months? Plus, if worse comes to worse, she can always just sail directly back. But instead, during the brilliant moment that's supposed to define her character, Brick's plan is just to Michael Phelps it all the way back to Middle-earth and hope for the best, I guess. Never even considering the possibility that doing this would realistically amount to suicide. Meanwhile, we then jump back to the Southlands, where a farmer strolls up to Bronwyn's house asking to treat a sick cow, only to discover that it has Mordor raids. This causes blind Legolas to travel over to the neighboring town, where he confirms that it's been raided, and in fact is infested with Mordor raids. Well, at least I'm assuming that Arondir is practically blind, because otherwise I have no idea how the hell he could have possibly missed the towering billows of smoke with his elf vision.
Legolas, what do your elf eyes see?
My eyes! My eyes!
And you're meaning to tell me that there was absolutely no one who survived the attack and managed to make it over to this village? Or at the very least find a way to send warning to any of the other nearby settlements or watchtowers? Yeah, I have a hard time buying that, especially since it happens quite frequently in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Also, on a completely separate note, I do appreciate that the random doctor lady decides just to abandon her son to go on what is at the very least a 2 days journey, and doesn't even bother so much to tell him.
Halden's a day's journey. If I leave now, I can reach it by dusk.
I'm going with you.
What a bitch.
Regardless, now that blind Legolas has finally discovered that this rando town has been raided, you'd assume his immediate response would be to alert his detachment and round up a group to search for survivors. Because, well, that's what anyone with half a brain cell would do. But Brainrot is a rather infectious disease throughout this mutilated version of Middle-earth, and blind Legolas clearly isn't immune to it. He instead decides to leave this unarmed civilian completely defenseless and crawl down a tunnel that he has zero clue where it leads to, nor has any knowledge of what's even down there to begin with.
Not a great plan.
Though hey, what's the worst that could happen? It's not like he could get ambushed by a couple of orcs. Through sheer dumb luck, Bronwyn somehow manages to make it back to town and warn the other villagers of what's just happened.
We must spread the word.
No, I will not have this gossip, Bronwyn. I've seen landslides less dangerous than a wayward tongue without proof or pudding.
So, just a couple of issues here. First off, why in the absolute peanut butter fuck would people assume on face value that she's lying about a neighboring town having been raided and burnt to the ground? Is this something that the locals normally lie about? What benefit would she get by lying about something like this? And secondly, if you really don't trust your village doctor, for some incredibly strange reason, then just send someone to go check. Best case scenario is that Bronwyn is a nutcase, while the worst case scenario results in everyone getting mercilessly slaughtered or imprisoned. There's really zero gray area when dealing with either of these hypotheticals, but because everyone in this town is completely detached from reality, they simply hand-wave her away, where she is then forced to kill an orc with her son via a makeshift hanging. And it's fortunate that the orcs just decided to not invade this village like they did with the last one. Otherwise, everyone would have been, what some might say, royally screwed. But it turns out that beheading an orc instantaneously makes you the new mayor around here.
If there are any of you here who want to live, we make for the Elven Tower at first light.
Come to think of it, I'm not entirely certain there ever was a leader to begin with. There's no established militia or even a town guard, and with the elves officially gone, you'd assume there'd be some type of power vacuum for the villagers to deal with. Let alone that no one seems to be concerned over the fact that their settlement is left utterly defenseless. There's a thin veil of world-building dressed over this show. It wants to pull you in with the premise of exploring the Second Age of Middle-earth, all while refusing to realize concepts, settings, events, or characters past the surface level. In many ways, the narrative seems
sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
The show surprisingly has very little to say despite its rather extensive run times for each episode, which promptly leads us into the second one. Female Frodo and Cuckwise Samshi stumble upon a meteor man. In all reality, he's essentially just a discounted version of Gandalf, but the show can't use his actual name for legal reasons, so he's just referred to as the Stranger. However, unlike the creators of this show, I'm actually willing to give these characters established names, so for the rest of this video, he'll officially be known as Discount Gandalf. And what's this? Apparently this fire isn't hot either. Remember? Like the beginning of the last episode? Man, the script really isn't a fan of subtlety, is it? Either way, this definitely calls into question as to where the connecting tissue is between these two encounters and the impact it has on the world overall. It's evident that there's supposed to be some greater context for this phenomena. Sure would be a shame if the show basically ignored that entire setup for the rest of the plot and invoked the imagery of cold fire for no reason whatso-fucking-ever. You'd think with 8 hours worth of runtime, they'd be able to come up with some form of explanation. Anyways, the both of them then decide to hide Discount Gandalf from the rest of the village because... yeah, actually, I have no idea why they decide to do that. A crazy magic man has just crashed down from outer space near their caravan, and their initial response is to not go inform someone who would potentially be way more knowledgeable about this sort of shit. Hell, you don't even have to bring Discount Gandalf to your camp, just have Sadok come out there and assess the situation. I mean, he is the leader of their group, I'm assuming. However, female Frodo explains to Samshi why she's decided to help Discount Gandalf.
He could have landed anywhere and he landed here. It's like there's a reason this happened, like I was supposed to find him. Me. I can't walk away from that, not till I know he's safe.
Nori isn't compelled to do the right thing because it's in her nature to help others, but rather under the belief that Discount Gandalf was placed there for her by some cosmic entity so that she can fulfill some higher purpose and seek out the adventure she's been longing for. It's borderline conceited and not the type of character motivation that you would expect from a protag in a Tolkien property. When you contrast that with The Lord of the Rings, Frodo is ultimately someone thrust into an incredibly trying circumstance who's forced to make the best of what's laid out before him.
I wish the ring had never come to me.
All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
During the Council of Elrond, he recognizes that only he is truly capable of carrying out such an arduous task, and makes the conscious choice to take the ring to Mordor, despite witnessing the heavy toll that's attached with being a ring bearer and all of the hardship he's already had to endure at this point. No matter how hard the show tries, a parallel can't be drawn between Frodo and Nori because they exist within entirely different worlds in terms of their respective principles, decision-making, and overall characterization. However, we then cut away to Bitrond. Turns out he's been tasked with working alongside Celebrimbor on a very special project.
A tower. One that can host a forge. What seems to be the difficulty? I need it completed by spring. Have you considered seeking partners outside the confines of our own race?
How far outside?
Celebrimbor, friend of the dwarves, the elf who helped create the Doors of Durin, apparently has never thought to form some type of relation with Khazad Dûm during the middle of the Second Age. It's astonishing that there really is no character in this show that's spared from being a self-absorbed, paint-huffing Neanderthal. I'm not really sure what a creative decision like this even stands to accomplish, other than to purposefully jumble continuity for the sake of doing it. And it would be one thing if we were seeing the origin point of elves delegating with the dwarves to form some kind of partnership. But the roles have been flipped in this scenario where now Elrond is the one who supposedly has a long-standing relationship with Durin. Or at least it would appear that way at first glance. In all actuality, Durin is a bit pissed at Elrond and refuses to hold an audience with him.
Inform Lord Durin that his friend, Elrond...
As judgment has already been rendered, Elf.
I invoke the right of Sigyn Tarag.
So I just want to get something crystal clear here. So, instead of resourcefully relying on a useful bit of information about his friend to potentially appeal to his interests, he resorts to some crazy dwarven custom that forces Durin to allow him into his home and partake in a rock-breaking contest. One in which, should Elrond lose, he will forever be banned from all dwarven lands and block off Eregion's only means of creating Celebrimbor's tower by spring.
I like your plan, except it sucks.
Yeah, this version of Elrond isn't particularly all that bright, and apparently neither is Durin because he still holds counsel with him, despite having been ghosted for 20 years and having just won the contest.
Well, 20 years will do that.
You missed my wedding! The birth of my children, 2 of them! You cannot barge into my mountain and demand I welcome you with open arms!
Basically, this entire setup was effectively rendered meaningless, because Elrond never has to deal with the fallout for his unfathomably idiotic decisions. Keep in mind, he is supposed to be an ambassador for Eregion, and potentially jeopardizes their interests in standing amongst the dwarves, as well as his own, over a rock-breaking contest. What I'm trying to say is that none of this is particularly all that diplomatic for a character whose self-proclaimed craft is diplomacy.
You are master of your craft, my friend. Allow me a few days to work mine.
See, now that's some bullshit.
Meanwhile, Brick is still Michael Phelpsing her way across the Sundering Sea when she comes across a raft off in the distance. The survivors let her on board, only to seconds later pull a racism and chunk her ass back out into the ocean, where a giant sea worm then appears out of nowhere and eats everyone except her and Sauron. I mean, Halbrand. Halbrand can't be Sauron, that's ridiculous. He only has a strong affinity for forges, claims to have committed very serious sins in the past, sins so heinous that he believes that Galadriel would hate him for it, and possesses a necklace that signifies his birthright to the entire region of what will later become Mordor. I'm certain nothing will become of that. But still, pretty insane that this giant-ass sea creature doesn't even bother to eat either one of them. It's yet another forced contrivance put on full display, where the scale of what our protags are faced with is so colossal that there really shouldn't be anything preventing them from getting absolutely torn to shreds, but miraculously aren't because the script demands it. There probably are more egregious examples of plot armor in future episodes, but it's a bit difficult to ignore this one when it's glaring at you directly in the face. But even then, if you were to completely isolate that problem, two more would still grow in its place. The aftermath of this encounter rings incredibly hollow because we spend, at best, a total of 5 minutes with these other characters. And the fact that Halbrand himself displays utter contempt for them just diminishes their role in the narrative even further, which makes his decision to save Brick shortly afterwards even more confusing. This scene was more or less assembled so that Halbrand could exist for the rest of the show, regardless of whether or not any of it actually makes sense. And like I said earlier, the plot is dependent on the both of them surviving this attack so that they can be rescued by Elendil.
It was the sea that put her in my path, and the sea is always right.
I have to say, that is some real crack-ass fortune cookie wisdom if I've ever come across any. You should tell that to all the people that just got nommed on 30 minutes ago. I mean, what if you did ever come across someone that's drowning? Are you just going to leave them there because the sea is always right? God, it'd be nice for once to have a character make a moral choice out of their own volition, rather than because of some divine fate bullshit.
His mother. What happened to her?
She drowned.
The sea is always right!
Moving on though, Galadriel and not Sauron are brought before the Queen Regent Miriel. Even though technically Pharazôn should be the one in power currently, but listen, if I was going to go over every single time how this show breaks lore, this video would end up being 10 hours long. So, with all of that now out of the way, here is this complete clusterfuck of an exchange.
It's been generations since a ship of Numenor was permitted to make such a journey on an elf's behalf.
The elf means...
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it.
I welcome you to try.
I have no need of your welcome.
And you are quickly wearing out yours.
I'm genuinely baffled and almost impressed in a sense at just how nonsensical the dialogue is. The Numenorians, or at least a sweeping majority of them, have an utterly transparent hatred for elves.
Elf ships on our shore. Elf workers taking your trades.
I'm gonna come.
Both of them arriving here is definitely stirring up unrest, which naturally means that Miriel and Pharazôn would want them off the island immediately, especially with what we learn about their characters later on in the show. But after pointing out that they haven't sent a ship to Middle-earth on an elf's behalf for a considerable amount of time, Brick's knee-jerk response is to indirectly threaten to kill the Queen Regent of Numenor in front of all her armed guards.
They paid for this isle with the blood of their kin.
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it. But one way or another, I will depart.
Why are you the way that you are? Honestly, every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way. I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
This sadistic, revenge-driven, warmongering version of Galadriel is incapable of having an ounce of moral culpability attached to her character. She can openly threaten the life of the Queen of Numenor herself in a public setting and face zero consequences for it because of some insane roll-of-the-dice miracle that's artificially crammed into the narrative. That's right, Halbrand manages to get everyone in the room to come to some form of compromise by suggesting that they be allowed to stay on the island for 3 whole days. From a quick glance, and I do put the emphasis on the word quick, all of this could be chalked up to Halbrand resourcefully using his charisma to break up a potentially deadly conflict, until you quickly realize his solution is the very thing that caused this whole issue in the first goddamn place. Both of them staying is the least desired outcome that everyone involved, aside from Halbrand, should desperately want to avoid based on all of their motivations. And the only reason he even suggested is because he really liked the look of that forge 5 minutes ago. Still, all of this bullshit ends up working. The both of them are allowed to stay on the island with the exception that Brick be restricted to the palace grounds. A somewhat reasonable order, I might add, given the nature of things, that Brick still shortly after this scene completely disregards, and threatens to kill Elendil if she's not granted access to a ship.
Suppose the words never managed to escape your throat.
Supposing they did, you'd be back at the palace in chains, even further from your destination.
Who is this mortal who speaks to me as if he has the slightest idea who I am?
I can't take it anymore! I just want to die!
Do you seriously have to be a complete turbo cunt to everyone you come across? Let alone to the guy who made the grievous mistake of saving your life. He's attempting to have a civil conversation and you decide in the moment to potentially shank him with your dead brother's knife that you wrongfully pillaged from his grave. I just want to highlight that not even the person who may or may not be Sauron, the overarching villain of Middle-earth, is this ungrateful or cruel. However, during their conversation, Elendil casually mentions a Hall of Lore, which for some incredibly obscure reason is enough to grab her interest and demand to be taken there. Never mind that Elendil would have zero incentive or motive to do so after having just been threatened to be motherfucking stabbed. Brick is really in no position to be demanding him of anything, especially considering that he went out of his way to save her life. But because this version of Elendil is a washed-up pushover, he caves and agrees to take her there, where we are then subjected to whatever this ungodly monstrous excuse for a slow-mo shot is.
My eyes! My eyes!
I mean, honestly, what did this horse ever do to deserve any of this? It was probably living a peaceful, quiet life, grazing and eating grass, doing whatever it is that horses do, only to be suddenly tossed into this complete eyesore of a scene, which by now has surely been memed into oblivion, and rightfully so, because all of this is utterly shameful.
Shame! Shame!
But following all of that, Elendil then brings Brick some rather remarkably important documents.
The account of a human spy retrieved from an enemy dungeon. He drew this.
Wait a moment. I must be blind.
Jesus Christ, where to even begin with all this? I suppose we'll tackle this chronologically. So a human spy who was kept in a dungeon during the War of Wrath somehow managed to escape and obtain Sauron's secret plan to take over the Southlands in the process, where they then marked the location of the tower they were held captive in with this insanely vague symbol rather than a more detailed depiction of where it might be located. This information is then brought all the way over to Numenor because men weren't gifted the Isle of Numenor until after the War of Wrath, where over the course of thousands of years these documents just sat around, somehow never managing to wither or get lost, until Galadriel shows up and is able to draw a correlation between this symbol and the Southlands because she pulled a Rise of Skywalker.
What made you mad enough to want to...
Pure ignorance, sheer stupidity, and wild recklessness.
Yeah, if any scene had Jar Jar Abrams' filthy hands all over it, it's definitely this glorified train wreck of an exposition dump. And just to be clear, the entire plot for this season, and everything throughout the rest of the Second Age, is entirely built upon Sauron leaving symbols around, marking the exact location of where he plans on amassing his secret army, that no one other than the orcs and Galadriel were smart enough to decipher, thus officially establishing that the vast majority of elves, men, and dwarves are all significantly less intelligent than orcs.
Good job!
The levels of contrivance and malicious retconning we're dealing with here is astonishing. Though to make matters worse, Brick was already planning on making her way over to the Southlands anyways, because Halbrand revealed that the orcs were planning on invading the Southlands while they were on the raft.
Are you going to tell me where the enemy is or not?
The Southlands.
So she's really not gaining wildly new information from any of this. Making a huge deal out of information that the viewer and other characters already know isn't grandiose or captivating. It's tedious and redundant. A little subtlety, at the very least, would have been appreciated, but like I said earlier, I'm not sure if the creative leads are aware that word exists. Sadly, we are then forced to jump back to the Harfoots. To be perfectly honest with you, I kind of forgot all about them until just now. It's rather easy to do that when their entire storyline has no real impact on the plot for this season. But either way, Nori is teaching Discount Gandalf how to eat snails when her dad takes a rather unfortunate spill and injures his ankle. This is cause for major concern amongst the rest of the caravan, where a very pressing question is brought up.
How bad is it? Can he migrate?
You saw him. Wouldn't put the weight of a leaf on that leg, much less pull a cart.
Mind your own fire, Malva.
Okay, so I sort of lied whenever I said there's no huge distinction between Shire Hobbits and Harfoots. There is absolutely one. Harfoots are apparently hedonistic little shit fiends who leave one another for dead if they can't keep up during a migration, or slightly inconvenience the group in any way.
And should any Harfoot fall behind this migration, they likewise will be carried with us in our hearts and in our memories. Lovo Baljabook. Bees. We all loved him, but he wasn't Egypt.
No, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah!
Take their wheels and leave them.
You know, Malva, it would be grand if you weren't right all the time. Sadok wants the Harfoots to be in peace. They're the beating heart of the story, and we stick together to survive.
If by heartbeat you mean the adrenaline that pumps through your body as you're being strangled to death in your sleep by a deranged psychopath, then yeah, I guess they are technically the heartbeat of this story. But again, the entire Harfoot subplot is rather inconsequential, and while this show might enjoy wasting your time, I certainly do not. So we can just ignore them from here on out. Not that there would really be much to talk about anyways. Nori's whole arc consists of her meeting a crazy space hobo who is later revealed to be Gandalf.
When in doubt, Eleanor Brandyfoot. Always follow your nose.
Shut up! Will you shut up?
Okay, I lied again. There is one last thing I wanted to touch on with the Harfoots, and that is the unspeakable sin ripoff Samwise commits at the beginning of episode 5.
That not all who wander or wander are lost.
Move this man!
I will keep pounding this point into submission. As someone who adores Tolkien's work, I'm totally fine with altering or foregoing certain aspects of source material if it's done for the sake of crafting the best possible narrative you can. But this change wasn't even remotely necessary to the story Amazon wanted to tell, nor does it even serve as proper fan service. Not only does this retcon Gandalf into misquoting someone, but it also unironically insinuates that Bilbo ripped his poem about Aragorn off from She-Wise Gam-Cheeks. This is not a trivial nitpick. You are diminishing meaningful in-universe contributions made from legacy characters, while simultaneously appropriating them onto non-canonical ones simply because you can. It is not fan service, it is fan disservice. A disservice to beloved characters, a disservice to significant events, a disservice to the world Tolkien crafted. And fans pointing that out doesn't make them patently evil. However, on that note, I'm effectively going to have to wrap things up there. I was initially hoping I'd be able to cover all of the first season in one video, but surprisingly there is such a thing of a show giving someone entirely too much material to work with. And given my upload schedule lately, I wanted to get this one out there while this smoldering trash fire is still somewhat relevant. At this rate, I'll realistically have all the other parts finished by the time I'm 80, but in the meantime, if you want to support what I do, then feel free to do all the usual algorithm stuff to see more content like this in the future. Either way, thank you all for watching.
Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.